Part 1. The Carnival of Ashwick Hollow. There were villages in England that seemed untouched by time. Ashwick Hollow was one of them. Nestled between rolling green hills and ancient oak woods, it appeared on no famous tourist maps and attracted little attention from the outside world. Yet, those who lived there often claimed it was the finest village in the county. It had a stone church, whose bells had rung for nearly 300 years, Market Square, with crooked buildings that leaned slightly toward one another, like old friends sharing secrets. A narrow river that reflected the sky so perfectly on quiet afternoons that one could almost imagine another world beneath its surface. Perhaps most importantly, Ashwick Hollow had traditions. The villagers guarded them fiercely. Among those traditions, none was more beloved than the Midsummer Carnival. Every June, colourful banners stretched across the streets. Children raced through the square carrying paper lanterns. Farmers brought flowers. Bakers prepared special cakes. And musicians gathered from neighbouring villages to perform beneath strings of golden lights. For one magical evening, Ashwick Hollow forgot its worries, or at least pretended to, because every village, however peaceful it appeared, carried its own collection of hidden sorrows. Miss Marple had always believed that. Human nature, she often said, was remarkably similar everywhere. The same weaknesses, the same ambitions, the same fears. Whether one lived in London or a tiny countryside village, people remained people, and people kept secrets. On the morning of the carnival, Ashwick Hollow awoke beneath brilliant sunshine. The village square buzzed with activity. Volunteers hurried between stalls. Children practiced dances. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the air. At the centre of it all moved a young woman named Evelyn Hart. At 19, Evelyn possessed the sort of beauty people rarely noticed immediately. She was not striking in the conventional sense. Her charm lived elsewhere, in her warm smile, and the kindness she showed strangers. In the way she listened when others spoke, people found themselves trusting her without quite understanding why. That morning she carried a clipboard under one arm and moved briskly between carnival booths. Mrs. Finch, the flower competition entries need to be placed near the fountain. Mr. Turner, the musicians are asking where they should unload their instruments. Tommy, please stop climbing the fountain before you break your neck. The villagers laughed. Everyone seemed to know Evelyn, and everyone liked her. At least, that was what they claimed. Yet, as she crossed the square, several pairs of eyes followed her. Some with affection, some with curiosity, one or two with unmistakable concern. Because during the previous few weeks, Evelyn had changed, only slightly, enough for observant people to notice. She had become distracted, thoughtful, sometimes distant, as though her mind was occupied by something she dared not discuss openly. Her closest friend, Clara Whitmore, had noticed it first. Shortly before noon, Clara found Evelyn arranging decorations near the church gate. "You hardly slept last night, did you?" Clara asked. Evelyn looked up. A faint smile appeared. "What makes you think that? You have shadows under your eyes." "I've been busy. You've been worried." Evelyn hesitated. For a moment she seemed ready to say something. Then she glanced around. The smile returned, but it felt forced. "Everything will make sense soon." Clara frowned. "What does that mean?" "You'll see." "Evelyn, it's nothing." It was clearly not nothing. Clara knew her friend too well. Yet before she could ask another question, someone called Evelyn's name from across the square. The moment vanished, and with it, the opportunity for answers. That afternoon, several miles away, an elderly lady sat comfortably beside a cottage window. She was knitting, or appeared to be. In truth, she spent most of her time observing. The village where she currently stayed was not Ashwick Hollow, but a neighbouring community. Even so, Information had a remarkable habit of finding its way to Miss Marple. A local vicar had recently mentioned an unusual situation, a young woman researching village history, an old diary, strange questions concerning events that occurred decades earlier. Most people would have ignored such details. Miss Marple never did, because seemingly insignificant details often proved important later. Very important. She set aside her knitting. Outside, birds sang cheerfully, a perfect summer day, yet she experienced the faintest feeling of unease, the sort that occasionally arrived before unpleasant events. Not evidence, not logic, merely instinct, and instinct had served her surprisingly well over the years. Back in Ashwick Hollow, evening descended slowly. As darkness approached, lanterns illuminated the streets, music filled the square. Laughter echoed from every direction. Families gathered, visitors arrived from nearby villages. Carnival had begun. Evelyn moved through the celebrations, greeting guests, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. Outwardly she appeared relaxed. Inside, however, anxiety tightened around her heart, because tonight mattered. Everything depended upon tonight. For weeks she had wrestled with a decision. Remain silent, or tell the truth. The diary she had discovered months earlier had altered everything. At first it seemed like an ordinary historical document, the forgotten writings of a village resident long dead. She began reading carefully. Emerged dates, transactions, letters, pieces of a story hidden for 30 years. A story someone had worked very hard to bury. The deeper she investigated, the more disturbing the truth became. Respected people, powerful people, good reputations built upon lies. She had gathered enough evidence to expose them. Tonight she intended to take the final step. Yet fear lingered, because once the truth emerged, there would be no turning back. Near 9 o'clock, fireworks burst above the village. Children cheered. The crowd applauded. For a few moments, everyone gazed skyward. Everyone except Evelyn. She stood near the churchyard entrance, watching a particular house across the square. The Hawthorne residence, one of the oldest homes in Ashwick Hollow. The Hawthorne family had been respected for generations. Wealthy, influential, charitable. The sort of family people described as pillars of the community. Evelyn's eyes lingered there. Then she looked away. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Enjoying the fireworks?" She turned. A young man stood nearby. Daniel Pierce, 24 years old, schoolteacher, kind-hearted, and hopelessly in love with her. He had never quite found the courage to say so directly. She smiled genuinely this time. "Aren't you supposed to be supervising children?" "They escaped. Terrible teacher." "I know," she laughed softly. For a brief moment her worries faded. Daniel studied her face. "You've been troubled lately." The smile disappeared. "Have I? Something's wrong." She said nothing. The silence itself became an answer. Finally Daniel spoke quietly. "If you're in danger, tell me." A strange expression crossed her face. Fear, sadness, and perhaps regret. Then she surprised him. She reached out and squeezed his hand. "You're a good man, Daniel." His heart skipped. "Evelyn, if anything happens..." She stopped. "No." "What?" She shook her head. "Forget it." But Daniel could not forget. Not after hearing those words. Not after seeing the fear in her eyes. The evening continued. Several villagers later reported unusual conversations. Small remarks, passing comments, pieces of a puzzle that would only gain significance afterward. Around 10 o'clock, Evelyn told Clara some truths refused to stay buried. At 10:30, she reportedly asked the church caretaker whether the old crypt entrance remained locked. 11:15, she was seen speaking with a member of the Hawthorne family. Witnesses disagreed about the details. Some claimed the conversation appeared tense. Others insisted it seemed perfectly civil. Memory, Miss Marple often observed, was a highly unreliable servant. At 11:45, the carnival began winding down. Families returned home. Musicians packed equipment. The crowds thinned. A few villagers noticed Evelyn walking toward the town clock near the square. She seemed nervous, determined. 2 minutes later, at exactly 11:47 p.m., multiple witnesses saw her standing beneath the clock, alive, well, and entirely ordinary. No one imagined they were observing the last confirmed sighting before one of the strangest mysteries Ashwick Hollow had ever known. The church bell began counting the final minutes before midnight. The square grew quieter. Cool wind swept through the village. Lanterns swayed gently. Then the clock struck 12. 1 bell, 2, 3. The sound echoed through empty streets. By the time the final chime faded into silence, Evelyn Hart had vanished. Not walked away. Not run, vanished. The place where she had stood moments earlier was empty. No scream, no struggle, no witness. Nothing. Only a small silver locket lying on the cobblestones beneath the clock, waiting to be found. And in the darkness beyond the square, unseen by everyone, an old secret stirred once more. Part 2. The last words before midnight by dawn, Ashwick Hollow had ceased to be a peaceful village. News travelled with astonishing speed in small communities. A baker mentioned it to a customer. Customer told a neighbour. The neighbour informed 3 others. Within hours, everyone knew. Evelyn Hart was missing, and no one could explain how. Carnival decorations still hung across the square, fluttering sadly in the morning breeze. Lanterns remained suspended above empty streets. Bright colours that had seemed festive only hours earlier now appeared strangely out of place, as though the village itself had awakened inside a bad dream. Near the town clock, a small crowd had gathered behind police barriers. Constable Edward Briggs stood guard, while investigators examined the area. Fortunately, there was very little to examine. No footprints, no blood, no signs of a struggle. Nothing except the silver locket found beneath the clock. Inspector Harold Finch arrived from the county headquarters shortly after 7 o'clock. He was a practical man in his early 50s who preferred facts over theories. Unfortunately, facts were in short supply. He crouched beside the evidence table and studied the locket. Simple silver heart, slightly worn, inexpensive, the sort of keepsake a young woman might treasure. Belonged to the missing girl? He asked. Constable Briggs nodded. According to her friend, Clara Whitmore. Finch opened the locket carefully. Inside were 2 tiny photographs. One showed Evelyn as a child. The other showed her parents. Neither image provided any obvious clue. The inspector sighed. Not much to work with. No, sir. Finch glanced toward the square. Villagers watched anxiously from behind the barriers. Whenever a mystery appeared in a small village, fear quickly followed. Because if something impossible could happen to one person, perhaps it could happen to anyone. Meanwhile, Clara Whitmore sat in the Hart family's kitchen with trembling hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea. Across from her sat Margaret Hart, Evelyn's mother. She had not slept. The strain showed clearly on her face. Every few minutes, she glanced toward the front door, as if expecting her daughter to walk through it smiling and apologizing for causing concern. But the door remained closed. Perhaps she's confused, Margaret whispered. Or injured, Clara struggled to answer. The truth was difficult to ignore. Evelyn would never vanish without contacting her mother. Never. She wasn't careless. She wasn't selfish. And she certainly wasn't cruel. Something had happened. The question was what? A knock interrupted the silence. Daniel Pierce entered. His expression immediately revealed that he carried no good news. Margaret looked at him hopefully. Have they found her? Daniel lowered his eyes. No. The hope disappeared. Margaret's shoulders sagged. For several moments nobody spoke. Then Clara remembered something. A detail that had seemed unimportant yesterday. Now it felt different. Important. Potentially vital. She looked at Daniel. She said something strange. When? Last night, Daniel leaned forward. What? Clara hesitated. Memory remained vivid. Evelyn standing near the church gate, looking worried, looking tired. Everything will make sense soon, Clara said quietly. Daniel frowned. That's all? No, she swallowed. Later she told me that some truths refuse to stay buried. The room fell silent. Margaret stared at her. Truths? I don't know. But deep inside, Clara suspected she did, or at least suspected where those truths might be hiding. Inside the old diary. The diary had become Evelyn's obsession during the previous 3 months. She discovered it while helping catalogue historical documents stored in the church archives. Most of the records contain nothing remarkable. Baptisms, marriages, property transfers, ordinary village history. Then she found a leather-bound journal hidden inside a damaged storage chest. The author was a woman named Eleanor Price, a resident of Ashwick Hollow who died decades earlier. At first glance, the journal appeared ordinary. Daily observations, village gossip, personal reflections. Scattered throughout the entries were references to meetings, land sales, and disagreements involving several prominent families, most notably the Hawthorns. Evelyn became fascinated. She spent weeks cross-checking names and dates. Deeper she investigated, the stranger things became. And then she stopped talking about her research altogether. That change alone had alarmed Clara. Because Evelyn normally shared everything. Inspector Finch spent most of the morning interviewing witnesses. Fortunately, witness statements created more confusion than clarity. Everyone had seen Evelyn. Everyone remembered something different. Mrs. Finch, the baker's wife, claimed Evelyn seemed cheerful. Musician insisted. She looked frightened. A shopkeeper believed she had been waiting for someone. Another swore she was alone. By midday, the inspector possessed pages of notes and very few answers. Then came the Hawthorn family interviews. The Hawthorns occupied a position unlike any other family in Ashwick Hollow. Their influence stretched back generations. They funded charities, maintained village landmarks, supported local events. People trusted them instinctively. At least they always had. Arthur Hawthorn, the current family patriarch, welcomed Inspector Finch into his study. The room reflected old wealth, dark wood, ancient paintings, bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. Arthur himself appeared calm, perhaps too calm. Evelyn Hart, he said thoughtfully, pleasant young woman. You spoke with her last night. Arthur nodded, briefly. What did you discuss? The carnival. Only the carnival? A slight pause. Yes. Finch watched him carefully. Years of experience had taught him that hesitation mattered, sometimes more than words. Several witnesses described the conversation as tense. Arthur smiled faintly. People enjoy inventing drama. Did Miss Hart accuse your family of anything? The smile vanished, only for a moment. Finch noticed. No. The answer arrived too quickly. Inspector Finch made a note. That afternoon, an elderly visitor arrived in Ashwick Hollow. The villagers recognized her immediately. Many had heard stories. Some had heard legends. Few knew how many mysteries she had actually solved. Miss Marple stepped from the bus carrying a small handbag, and wearing her usual expression of gentle curiosity. The village seemed transformed. Fear hung in the air. People whispered. Windows opened slightly as she passed. Human beings, she reflected, reacted to mysteries much as birds reacted to storms. They sensed danger before understanding its nature. The vicar greeted her near the church. Thank goodness you've come. My dear vicar, Miss Marple replied pleasantly. That sounds rather dramatic. It is dramatic. He lowered his voice. The entire village is terrified. Miss Marple glanced toward the square. Quite understandable. You think something terrible happened? She considered the question. Perhaps. Perhaps. My experience has taught me that terrible events often look quite ordinary at first. The vicar sighed, hoping for reassurance. "I'm afraid I rarely provide it." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the church archives. The room smelled of dust and old paper. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows. Rows of records lined wooden shelves. It was here that Evelyn had discovered Eleanor Price's diary. The vicar handed it to her carefully. "Inspector Finch has already examined it." Miss Marple opened the worn journal. The handwriting was elegant but fading. She began reading. At first the entries seemed harmless. Village gatherings, weather observations, harvest celebrations. Then she noticed something. Patterns, repeated names, repeated concerns, and one particular entry that caused her eyes to narrow slightly. The passage had been written 30 years earlier, a short paragraph hidden among ordinary observations. It mentioned documents, property transfers, and a warning that someone powerful was not what they seemed. Interesting, very interesting, Miss Marple continued reading. An hour passed, then another. The vicar eventually returned. "Found anything?" Miss Marple closed the diary. "Possibly." She smiled gently. "My dear vicar, one must never rush to conclusions. What do you think happened to Evelyn?" Miss Marple looked toward the church window. Beyond it stood the village cemetery. Ancient gravestones, long-forgotten names, secrets buried beneath the earth. "The moment," she said quietly, "I think Evelyn discovered something that frightened someone." That evening, another witness finally came forward, an elderly groundskeeper named Thomas Reed. He had remained silent because he assumed his information was irrelevant. Now he wasn't so sure. Inspector Finch interviewed him immediately. "What did you see?" Reed shifted uneasily. "Not exactly saw, sir." "What then?" "Heard." The inspector leaned forward. "When?" "About 11:50. A silence followed. 11:50. Only minutes before Evelyn disappeared. "What did you hear?" The old man swallowed. "Voices. Whose voices? I couldn't tell." "How many?" "Two." Finch's attention sharpened. "Where?" The groundskeeper pointed toward the church, near the old graveyard wall. "What were they saying?" Reed frowned. "I only caught one sentence." "What sentence?" The old man looked genuinely troubled. Then he repeated the words exactly as he remembered them. "You don't understand what you're digging up." The room became very still. Suddenly, Evelyn's disappearance seemed connected to something far larger than a missing girl. Somewhere inside Ashwick Hollow lay a secret old enough to survive 30 years, secret powerful enough to frighten respectable people, perhaps powerful enough to make a young woman vanish before midnight. Miss Marple, upon hearing the statement later that evening, said nothing for several moments. Then she quietly folded her hands and asked a question no one else had considered. "Tell me," she said, "who benefits most if the truth remains buried?" The answer, she suspected, would eventually reveal everything. Part 3. Secrets. Hidden. In the diary the following morning arrived beneath a sky heavy with grey clouds. Rain threatened but never quite fell. Ashwick Hollow seemed suspended in a strange state between ordinary life and quiet panic. The baker still opened his shop. The postman still made his rounds. Children still walked to school, yet every conversation eventually returned to the same subject. Evelyn Hart. 3 days had passed since her disappearance. 3 days without a single confirmed sighting. 3 days without answers, and with every passing hour, fear deepened. Inspector Finch understood the pattern well. First day brought hope. The second brought concern. By the third, people began imagining the worst. That morning, he sat inside the temporary police offices established in the village hall, reviewing notes for perhaps the 20th time. Witness statements, interview transcripts, maps, photographs. Everything pointed in different directions. Nothing connected. A knock sounded at the door. Miss Marple entered. She carried her handbag and wore the same calm expression that somehow managed to make other people feel nervous, particularly policemen. "Good morning, Inspector." Finch smiled politely. "Miss Marple." Though he remained sceptical of amateur detectives, experience had taught him that dismissing Miss Marple entirely would be foolish. Several respected officers had made that mistake. Most regretted it. She glanced at the paperwork scattered across his desk. "You look troubled." "I am troubled, as you should be." Finch laughed despite himself. "That isn't especially comforting." "No, but it's honest." She settled into a nearby chair. "Tell me, Inspector, what do you believe happened?" Finch considered carefully. "I think Evelyn discovered something. A reasonable conclusion. Someone became frightened. Also reasonable. But after that—" He shook his head. "Nothing fits. Perhaps because you're looking at the disappearance." "What else should I look at?" "The village." He frowned. "The village?" Miss Marple nodded. "My dear Inspector, people often imagine mysteries begin with crimes. They don't. Rarely." She folded her hands. "Mysteries usually begin with people." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple continued examining Eleanor Price's diary. She had borrowed it from the church archives and now sat beside a window in the vicarage. The journal rested open on her lap. Unlike Inspector Finch, who searched for dramatic revelations, Miss Marple focused on smaller details. Patterns, habits, contradictions, the sort of things most people overlooked. Eleanor Price had been an observant woman, remarkably observant. The diary contained dozens of entries describing ordinary village life. Yet between those ordinary observations lay something darker. One particular name appeared repeatedly: Jonathan Hawthorne, Arthur Hawthorne's father, a man remembered throughout Ashwick Hollow as generous, respectable, and honourable. The perfect gentleman, at least according to village history. According to Eleanor Price, however, the reality seemed rather different. Several entries hinted at disputes involving property ownership. There were references to missing documents, questions regarding inheritance claims, complaints from families who suddenly found themselves unable to prove legal ownership of land they had occupied for generations. Most intriguing of all was a final entry, written only weeks before Eleanor's death. The handwriting appeared rushed, uneven, as though she feared interruption. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read carefully. "The papers exist. I know they exist. Jonathan believes no one remembers, but memory is a stubborn thing. One day the truth will return. When it does, Ashwick Hollow will finally understand what was taken from it." No explanation followed. Further details. The diary ended there. Miss Marple closed the journal slowly. Thoughtful expression crossed her face. The words raised more questions than answers. Yet one fact seemed increasingly clear. Evelyn had not become obsessed with village history by accident. She had found something significant. Very significant. Meanwhile, Clara Whitmore searched Evelyn's bedroom. Not because the police asked her to, because she couldn't sit still any longer. The room remained exactly as Evelyn left it. Books lined the shelves, clothes hung neatly inside the wardrobe, a half-finished sketch rested on the desk. The familiarity hurt. Every object seemed to insist Evelyn should still be there. Clara opened drawers carefully, contained nothing useful. Letters, notes, receipts. Then she discovered a small wooden box hidden beneath the bed. Inside were research notes, dozens of pages, maps, copies of old records, names connected by handwritten arrows, dates circled in red ink. Clara's heart raced. She began reading. The notes revealed months of investigation. Evelyn had traced property transfers dating back 3 decades. Again and again, the same pattern appeared. Land originally belonging to local families eventually ended up under Hawthorne control. The transfers seemed legal, yet something felt wrong. Signatures didn't match. Witness statements contradicted one another. Entire documents appeared suspicious. At the bottom of one page, Evelyn had written a single sentence. The original deeds must still exist somewhere. Clara stared at the words. Then another detail caught her attention. Rough sketch. Not of a building, not of a document. A tunnel. Beneath the drawing Evelyn had written, "Church records mention old access routes sealed after the flood of 1892. Clara's pulse quickened. For the first time since Evelyn vanished, she felt she might be looking directly at something important. That evening, Daniel Pierce sat alone in the schoolhouse. A rain finally began falling outside. Softly at first, then steadily. The sound filled the empty building. In front of him rested a photograph. Evelyn, smiling, looking toward the camera, looking alive. Daniel had spent days helping with search efforts. Fields, forests, riverbanks. Everywhere, nothing. The frustration was becoming unbearable, because beneath his worry lurked another emotion. Guilt. He kept replaying their final conversation. Anything happens. The unfinished sentence haunted him. What had she intended to say? Had she known she was in danger? Had she expected something to happen? Or had she simply been afraid? The door opened suddenly. Daniel looked up. Clara entered. Her face was pale. Found something. Within minutes, she explained everything. The notes, the property records, the tunnel sketch. When she finished, Daniel sat motionless. Then he spoke quietly. "Have you shown this to the police?" "Not yet. We need to." Clara nodded, but neither moved immediately, because both understood what the discovery implied. Evelyn hadn't stumbled onto a harmless historical curiosity. She had uncovered evidence, and evidence could make dangerous people desperate. Following morning, Inspector Finch examined Evelyn's notes. His skepticism vanished quickly. Material was substantial, detailed, carefully researched, potentially explosive. By midday, he obtained warrants, allowing investigators to inspect several archived property records connected to the Hawthorne family. Reaction was immediate. Arthur Hawthorne arrived at the village hall personally. For the first time since the investigation began, his composure cracked. "This is absurd." Inspector Finch remained calm. "We're simply following evidence." "Evidence?" Arthur snapped. "Notes written by a missing girl. Those notes suggest irregularities. They suggest imagination." Finch watched him carefully. Fear often disguised itself as anger, and Arthur Hawthorne suddenly seemed very afraid. After he left, Miss Marple appeared unusually thoughtful. "What do you think?" Finch asked. She looked toward the window. "People become emotional when their reputations are threatened. You think he's guilty?" "No," the answer surprised him. "No?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not necessarily. But, my dear Inspector, one of the greatest mistakes in criminal investigations is assuming the frightened person must be the criminal." Finch frowned. "You believe someone else is involved?" "I believe several people know more than they're admitting." That night, another breakthrough occurred. A tired surveyor named Henry Lawson visited the police station carrying a faded map tube. He looked nervous, almost embarrassed. "I wasn't sure whether this mattered." "What is it?" Finch asked. "Church surveys." The inspector's attention sharpened immediately. "How old?" "About 40 years. Lawson carefully removed several maps. Yellowed paper spread across the desk. Detailed drawings of Ashwick Hollow appeared. Roads, fields, buildings, drainage routes, and beneath the church, network of tunnels. Inspector Finch stared. "So they were real, very real." Lawson nodded. "Collapsed years ago. Most, not all." The distinction mattered. One passage extended beneath the churchyard. Another led toward the village square. A third disappeared beneath land once owned by the Hawthorne family. Silence filled the room. Miss Marple studied the map closely. Then her eyes settled upon a small notation written in faded ink. A single word, storage. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. She leaned closer. Something about the tunnel layout bothered her. Not because of what appeared on the map, because of what didn't. A missing detail, a tiny inconsistency, the sort of thing most people would never notice. But Miss Marple noticed. Suddenly, she experienced the first genuine sense of excitement since arriving in Ashwick Hollow, because at last the mystery had begun to move. Elsewhere, hidden beneath the village itself, in darkness untouched by sunlight, for generations a young woman struggled to remain conscious. Evelyn Hart was alive, and she was running out of time. Part 4. The respectable family. The storm continued through most of the night. Rain battered the rooftops of Ashwick Hollow, while wind swept through narrow village lanes, rattling shutters and bending ancient trees. Inside their warm homes, the villagers slept uneasily. Many dreamed of Evelyn Hart. Some imagined her lost in the woods. Others feared something far worse. No one knew that while they slept, Evelyn lay trapped beneath their feet, alone, darkness, fighting to survive. The first thing Evelyn became aware of was thirst. It felt as though her throat had been filled with sand. When she opened her eyes, she saw nothing, only darkness. For several confused seconds, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory returned. The tunnel, footsteps behind her, the collapsing stone, the deafening crash, and afterward, silence. Pain shot through her shoulder as she tried to move. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. The injury wasn't fatal. It was serious. The falling debris had trapped her in a narrow section of the old tunnel. She had no idea how long she'd been unconscious. Hours? Days? Time had become meaningless underground. Carefully she reached into her coat pocket. The small flashlight still worked. Barely. Weak beam illuminated the cramped space around her. Broken stones blocked the passage behind. Ahead stretched another section of tunnel, disappearing into darkness. She had already attempted to clear the collapse. Possible. The stones were too heavy, the tunnel walls too unstable. Every effort only triggered more falling debris, so she had stopped and waited for someone to find her. But no one had come, not yet. Greatest fear wasn't death. It was that the truth would die with her. Above ground, Miss Marple sat beside the vicarage fireplace early the following morning. The old tunnel map rested on a small table. She studied it for what felt like the 100th time. Vicar watched with growing curiosity. Barely slept. No. And yet you seem pleased. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Do I, a little? How observant, the vicar sighed. My dear Miss Marple, you've discovered something. Possibly. Will you tell me what it is? No. The answer arrived immediately. Vicar groaned. Why not? Because I may be wrong. You usually aren't. Miss Marple's smile widened slightly. That is kind of you to say. She tapped a finger against the map. Human beings have a fascinating habit. What habit? They often lie about important things, the vicar nodded. Naturally. But they also lie about unimportant things. Now he looked confused. What difference does that make? A very significant difference. She pointed toward the church tunnel markings. Someone lied about these tunnels years ago. To hide something, perhaps. The vicar leaned forward. What? Miss Marple stared thoughtfully into the fire. A crime. The room fell silent. 30 years ago? He asked quietly. Possibly. And Evelyn discovered it. Miss Marple didn't answer. Which, the vicar had learned, often meant yes. At Hawthorne Manor, breakfast was unusually tense. Arthur Hawthorne sat at the head of the long dining table. His son Richard occupied a chair opposite him. Neither man had spoken much since the police investigation intensified. Finally, Richard broke the silence. They searched the archives again yesterday. Arthur continued eating. I know. They've started examining old property records. I know that too. Richard set down his cup. Perhaps we should tell them. Arthur's knife stopped moving. For several seconds neither man spoke. Then Arthur looked up. His expression had hardened. Tell them what? The truth. A dangerous silence followed. Richard immediately regretted the words, not because they were false, because they were true. Truth had become something the Hawthorne family feared. Arthur's voice emerged cold and controlled. Truth is a complicated thing. No, Richard shook his head. It isn't. Life teaches otherwise. Does it? Arthur stood slowly. His age suddenly seemed visible. Not weakness. Weariness. The burden of carrying secrets for too long. You don't understand. Then explain it. But Arthur looked away, toward the rain-streaked windows, toward the village beyond, toward memories he had spent decades trying to forget. Can't. Richard watched his father carefully. For the first time in his life, he realized Arthur wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting someone else, someone long gone, someone whose mistakes still haunted the family. That afternoon, Inspector Finch received unexpected news. Forensic team examining archived records had discovered irregularities. Several signatures appearing on historic property documents didn't match authenticated examples from the same period. At least 4 deeds appeared suspicious, potentially forged. The revelation transformed the investigation overnight. What had begun as a missing person case now carried the possibility of historic fraud, and perhaps motive. Very powerful motive. Finch immediately arranged another interview with Arthur Hawthorne. This time, the meeting proved very different. The inspector placed copies of the disputed documents on the desk. Arthur stared at them. His face revealed nothing, but his hands tightened slightly. You recognize these? Yes. Can you explain the inconsistencies? No. You understand what this suggests? Arthur nodded. For us. The word seemed painful, as though speaking it aloud wounded him. Inspector Finch studied him carefully. You already suspected, didn't you? Arthur remained silent. Sometimes silence answered more clearly than words. Meanwhile, Clara and Daniel continued searching through Evelyn's research materials. They worked inside her bedroom, surrounded by notebooks, maps, and copied records. Most contained information they had already reviewed. Then Daniel discovered a folded letter hidden between pages of a notebook. The handwriting belonged to Evelyn. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Perhaps it had never been intended for delivery. Clara unfolded it carefully. The note contained only a few paragraphs, yet every sentence felt important. If you're reading this, something may have gone wrong. Both exchanged a glance. Daniel's heart began pounding. Clara continued reading. The diary was correct. The original documents still exist. Believe I know where they were hidden, but I cannot tell anyone yet. If I am right, someone else may already suspect what I've discovered. The handwriting grew less steady. I don't think they would hurt me. At least I hope not. People can do terrible things when they fear losing everything. Daniels swallowed hard. The final sentence struck him hardest. If I disappear, follow the truth, not the rumours. The letter ended there. Neither spoke for several moments. Eventually Clara whispered, "She knew." Daniel nodded slowly. She knew she was in danger. That evening, Miss Marple requested access to every surviving document connected to Jonathan Hawthorne. The task occupied most of the village archivists. Boxes arrived, letters, financial records, personal correspondence, legal documents. The sheer volume seemed overwhelming, but Miss Marple possessed extraordinary patience. Hour after hour she examined papers. Most proved irrelevant. Then, shortly before sunset, she found something. A letter, written 31 years earlier. Not by Jonathan Hawthorne. To him. The sender's name caused her eyebrows to rise. Eleanor Price, the diary's author. The letter was brief, but its tone was unmistakable. Not friendly, not respectful, threatening. You may deceive the village, but you cannot deceive history. The truth survives in ways you do not understand. Miss Marple reread the sentence twice, then 3 times. Interesting. Very interesting. She now possessed evidence that Eleanor Price had confronted Jonathan directly, which raised an obvious question. What happened afterward? Because according to village records, Eleanor died unexpectedly only weeks later. Natural causes, everyone claimed, yet suddenly Miss Marple wasn't entirely certain. Late that night, after everyone else had gone home, Miss Marple visited the church alone. The rain had finally stopped. Moonlight illuminated the ancient gravestones. The village slept peacefully, at least on the surface. She walked slowly along the churchyard path, past weathered stones, past names forgotten by history, until she reached the old crypt entrance, locked, dusty, unused, or so everyone believed. She examined the surrounding ground carefully, then smiled, a very small smile, the sort she wore when a puzzle piece finally slid into place. Because she had found something. Not evidence of murder, not evidence of kidnapping. Something far more valuable, proof. Proof that another person had visited the crypt recently. Very recently. Miss Marple touched the disturbed earth near the stone wall, then looked toward the darkness beyond. Somewhere nearby lay the final answer. She could feel it. The mystery was beginning to unravel, and when it did, one of Ashwick Hollow's most respected legends would collapse forever. Far below, deep within the forgotten tunnels beneath the village, Evelyn Hart heard something. A sound, faint, distant, almost impossible to believe. Footsteps. For the first time in days, hope returned. Hope, she knew, could be just as dangerous as despair. Part 5. Beneath the church the sound came again, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Evelyn sat upright so quickly that pain shot through her injured shoulder. For a moment she wondered whether exhaustion had finally begun affecting her mind. Days underground could do that. Darkness played tricks on people. Silence created illusions. Hope created even more dangerous ones. She held her breath. Tunnel became quiet again. Nothing. Only dripping water somewhere in the darkness. Her heart sank. Then a scrape, dull thud, and another footstep. Someone was there. Somewhere beyond the collapsed passage. Evelyn! The voice echoed faintly through the stone corridors. She froze. Not because she was afraid, because she recognized it. Daniel. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. For the first time since the tunnel collapse, she felt tears fill her eyes. She had spent days fighting fear, hunger, pain, and loneliness. But hearing a familiar voice nearly broke her. "Daniel!" she shouted. Her voice cracked from dehydration. For several terrible seconds there was no response. Evelyn. This time the voice sounded closer. Relief flooded through her so suddenly she almost laughed. Almost. Because another realization arrived immediately afterward. Daniel had found the tunnels. Then others might have found them too, including the person who followed her underground that night. Above ground, events had begun moving rapidly. The discovery near the church crypt had convinced Miss Marple of one thing. Someone besides Evelyn had been using the tunnel network recently. The disturbed earth was too fresh, the marks too obvious. What puzzled her was not the evidence itself, it was the timing. Why now? Why return after decades? The answer, she suspected, was connected to Evelyn's research, to whatever lay hidden beneath Ashwick Hollow. Earlier that morning, she had requested another meeting with Arthur Hawthorne. Unlike previous conversations, this one took place privately. No police, no witnesses, only Miss Marple and the aging patriarch. Arthur received her in the library. Room smelled of old books and fading memories. For several moments neither spoke. Miss Marple broke the silence. "Your father was frightened of Eleanor Price?" Arthur looked up sharply. The reaction lasted only a second, but it was enough. "You knew her?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," his voice sounded distant. "Child." And she accused Jonathan Hawthorne of fraud. Arthur stared into the fireplace. Many people accused my father of many things. Most accusations don't inspire threatening letters. The old man's expression darkened. seen them?" "Yes." Silence followed, heavy silence, the kind that appears when truth enters a room uninvited. Finally Arthur spoke. "My father wasn't the man people believed." Miss Marple said nothing. She simply waited. People often revealed more when given space. And Arthur Hawthorne seemed exhausted from carrying the burden alone. "He wasn't evil," Arthur continued quietly, "but he was ambitious. Ambitious people sometimes justify terrible decisions." Arthur nodded. "Especially when they convince themselves they're helping others." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "What happened 30 years ago?" Arthur closed his eyes. For several seconds he seemed much older than before. Then he answered, "The village trusted him." His voice barely rose above a whisper, and he betrayed that trust. Meanwhile, Inspector Finch had authorised a detailed search of the church grounds. Tunnel map, discovered by Henry Lawson, had changed everything. Search teams now focused their attention underground. Fortunately, decades of collapse made exploration dangerous. Several entrances had become inaccessible. Others were unstable. Progress was slow, painfully slow. Daniel refused to remain behind, despite repeated objections from the police. He joined the search effort, partly because he knew the village better than most, mostly because he couldn't bear doing nothing. Every hour mattered, minute. As rescuers examined the crypt area, Daniel noticed something strange. One section of wall looked different. Not obviously different, just enough to catch his attention. The stones appeared newer than those surrounding them. He remembered Evelyn's notes. The original deeds must still exist somewhere. And suddenly a thought occurred to him. "What if this isn't a wall?" he asked. The workers paused. Inspector Finch approached. "What do you mean?" Daniel pointed. "Look at the mortar." The inspector frowned. Several labourers began examining the stonework. Minutes later, one of them looked up. "Sir." "What is it?" The worker tapped a section of wall. A hollow sound echoed back. The atmosphere changed instantly. Within moments, tools were brought forward. Carefully, patiently, the stones began coming loose. Behind them appeared darkness. A hidden passage. Miss Marple, arriving shortly afterward, merely nodded, though she had expected exactly that. Deep underground, Evelyn's flashlight finally died. Weak beam flickered once, twice, then vanished completely. Darkness swallowed everything. She hated the darkness. Not because it was frightening, because it was lonely. In complete darkness, a person lost all sense of space. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. Memories became companions. She thought about her mother, about Clara, about Daniel, and about the night everything went wrong. The memory remained vivid. She had entered the tunnel shortly before midnight. Using information hidden within Eleanor Price's diary, crypt entrance had led her into a forgotten section of passage beneath the church. She remembered excitement, nervousness, hope, because she believed she was finally about to find proof that Jonathan Hawthorne had stolen land through forged documents, proof that Eleanor Price had been telling the truth. Then she heard footsteps, someone behind her. First, she assumed it was a police officer, or perhaps a curious villager. Then she realized something. Whoever followed her was trying not to be heard. That realization changed everything. She moved deeper into the tunnel. Footsteps quickened, so did hers, and the collapse. Stones, stuff, darkness, pain. Afterward, nothing. Confrontation. No attack. No glimpse of the person behind her. Only silence. That mystery troubled her most. Who had followed her? And why? By late afternoon, the rescue team advanced through the newly discovered passage. The route proved difficult. Several sections had partially collapsed. Others were flooded. The air smelled of damp stone and earth. Daniel remained near the front. Inspector Finch followed closely. Behind them walked Miss Marple. Despite her age, she moved with surprising determination. Eventually the passage divided. 3 tunnels branched in different directions. The rescue team paused. Map was consulted. Positions compared. Calculations made. Miss Marple studied the layout carefully, pointed toward the left-hand passage. That one. Finch looked surprised. Why? Because people behave predictably. The answer made little sense. At least not immediately. Yet after everything he had witnessed, the inspector had learned not to ignore her instincts. The search continued. 20 minutes later, they heard a sound. A distant voice, weak, faint, but unmistakably human. Daniel ran forward. Evelyn! A response echoed back through the darkness. The rescue team exploded into action. For the first time since her disappearance, they knew exactly where she was. Alive. While workers cleared debris, blocking Evelyn's chamber, Miss Marple remained unusually quiet. Something still bothered her. A detail. A missing piece. Finding Evelyn solved one mystery, but not the most important one. Because someone had followed her underground. Someone who knew she was investigating. Someone who feared what she might discover. The collapse itself appeared accidental. She was increasingly certain of that. But accidents often occurred in the presence of intentions. Intentions mattered a great deal. As workers finally broke through the remaining debris, cheers erupted throughout the tunnel. Daniel was the first person Evelyn saw. For several seconds neither spoke, neither seemed capable of it. Then Daniel laughed unexpectedly. The sort of laugh produced by overwhelming relief. Frightened everyone. Evelyn smiled weakly. I know. You could have mentioned you planned on disappearing. Her eyes filled with tears. Could you? Daniel looked confused. So could I what? Tell me how you felt. For one beautiful moment, even the mystery seemed to disappear. The darkness, fear, the uncertainty, all of it faded. Then Inspector Finch stepped forward. Evelyn. She looked at him. We need to ask you a question. Her expression changed. Because she already knew which question was coming. Followed you into the tunnels that night. The smile vanished. Slowly, completely, and for the first time since her rescue, genuine fear appeared in her eyes. Because she knew the answer. Thought. She did. And if she was correct, Ashwick Hollow was about to discover that its most dangerous secret had never been buried underground at all. It had been living among them the entire time. Part 6. The wrong suspect. For several seconds after Inspector Finch asked the question, the tunnel seemed to grow silent. The rescue workers stopped talking. Daniel looked at Evelyn expectantly. Even Miss Marple watched carefully. Not because she expected a dramatic revelation, because she wanted to observe Evelyn's reaction before hearing her answer. Human beings often revealed the truth with their faces long before they spoke. And at that moment Evelyn looked frightened, but not in the way everyone expected. She wasn't afraid of the person who followed her. She was afraid of being wrong. Finally, she took a slow breath. I never saw them clearly. Disappointment flickered across several faces. Inspector Finch remained patient. What did you see? A silhouette. A man? I think so. You think? The uncertainty frustrated him. Evelyn nodded weakly. The tunnel was dark. I only caught glimpses. What made you believe someone was following you? The footsteps. Anything else? She hesitated, then nodded. They knew where they were going. That answer caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. Inspector Finch frowned. What do you mean? Evelyn looked toward the tunnel walls. I got lost several times. The memory was still vivid. I had to keep checking my notes. But whoever followed me never hesitated. The group exchanged glances. That detail mattered. Someone familiar with the tunnels. Or someone who had visited them before. Miss Marple quietly folded her hands. Interesting, very interesting, because that detail eliminated several suspects she had been considering. By evening, Evelyn had been brought home. The entire village seemed to breathe again. People lined the streets when news spread, Shopkeepers left their stores. Children ran through the square, shouting excitedly. Even those who barely knew her appeared genuinely relieved. Ashwick Hollow had feared a funeral. Instead, it received a miracle. Yet, beneath the celebration lingered tension. Mystery remained unsolved. Evelyn was alive, but the truth was still buried, and everyone knew it. That night, while Evelyn rested upstairs, Inspector Finch interviewed her in the Hart family's sitting room. Miss Marple attended quietly. So did Daniel and Clara. The atmosphere felt more like a family gathering than a police interview, which, Miss Marple reflected, often encouraged honesty. "Evelyn," Finch began, "tell us exactly why you entered the tunnels." She nodded, found a reference in Eleanor Price's diary. "The original property deeds?" "Yes." "You believed they were hidden underground?" "I did." "Were you right?" A shadow crossed her face. Then she reached into a canvas bag, resting beside her chair. Carefully she removed a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The room became very still. Evelyn placed it on the table. "Collapse happened after I found these." Inspector Finch unwrapped the bundle. Ancient documents appeared inside. Property deeds, contracts, correspondence, records untouched for decades. As he examined them, his expression changed. Several signatures differed dramatically from those appearing on official village records. There was no doubt now. Fraud had been real. The evidence was overwhelming. Arthur Hawthorne's father had forged documents, stolen land, manipulated ownership claims, destroyed families. The respected village legend was collapsing before their eyes. Yet, Miss Marple seemed less interested in the papers than everyone else. Because one question continued troubling her, followed Evelyn. And why? The answer appeared obvious to most people. Richard Hawthorne. Within 24 hours, village gossip had effectively convicted him. He possessed motive, opportunity, family connections. People whispered in shops, at church, outside the post office. The conclusion spread rapidly. The Hawthornes were responsible. Case closed. Miss Marple disliked conclusions that arrived too quickly. They were often wrong. The following afternoon she visited Richard personally. He received her in the manor garden. The young man looked exhausted. The previous week had aged him noticeably. "You think I followed Evelyn. It wasn't a question." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Do you?" Richard stared at her. "Good." The answer surprised him. For a moment he simply blinked. "You don't?" "No." The relief on his face appeared genuine. Not performed, not calculated, genuine. Another useful observation. Richard sat heavily on a stone bench. Everyone else does. Everyone else enjoys simple explanations. And you don't. Miss Marple shook her head. Life rarely provides them. A faint smile appeared, the first she had seen from him. "You really don't think it was me?" "No." Richard looked away, toward the village beyond the estate grounds. Then he said something unexpected. "My grandfather was guilty." Miss Marple remained silent. He continued. "My father knew." The confession seemed painful. "But he wasn't protecting himself." Miss Marple nodded. "I know." Richard looked surprised. "Then why protect the family?" "Because families are complicated." For several moments neither spoke. Then Richard said quietly, "There is something else." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "What?" "The night Evelyn disappeared," he hesitated. "I saw someone leaving the church grounds." Meanwhile, Inspector Finch continued examining the recovered documents. The more he read, the worse the fraud appeared. Entire farms had changed ownership illegally. Several local families had been ruined. Some eventually left Ashwick Hollow altogether. Others remained, carrying resentment for decades. One name appeared repeatedly: Samuel Reed, the grandfather of Thomas Reed, the elderly groundskeeper. Finch frowned. The connection bothered him, because Thomas had become one of the investigation's most helpful witnesses. Almost too helpful. The thought lingered. Then he dismissed it. No, impossible, wasn't it? That evening, Miss Marple gathered several notes across her dining table. Names, dates, statements, observations. The mystery now consisted of two separate stories. One was solved. 30 years earlier, Jonathan Hawthorne committed fraud. Eleanor Price discovered the truth. The evidence disappeared. Simple enough. The second story remained unresolved. Someone followed Evelyn into the tunnels. Someone knew she was investigating. Someone had reason to fear discovery, and that person was not Richard Hawthorne. Miss Marple was certain of it. She reviewed witness statements again. One detail returned repeatedly. A sentence overheard near the churchyard. Shortly before midnight. You don't understand what you're digging up. At first, everyone assumed the statement referred to documents, secrets, history. But what if they were interpreting it too literally? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, because suddenly another possibility occurred to her. Not what Evelyn was digging up. Who, breakthrough, came the following morning. Unexpectedly, as breakthroughs often did. Miss Marple was walking through the cemetery when she encountered Thomas Reed. The elderly groundskeeper tipped his cap politely. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning." They chatted briefly about the weather, gardening, village life, perfectly ordinary topics. Then Thomas mentioned something seemingly insignificant, a childhood memory. The moment he spoke, Miss Marple stopped walking. "Could you repeat that?" Thomas looked confused. The part about your grandfather." "Oh," he shrugged. Grandfather always said the Hawthornes stole everything. Miss Marple remained still, and he spent years trying to prove it. A pause. Right up until his death. Miss Marple felt excitement stir for the first time in days. Not because of the statement itself, because of something hidden inside it, a contradiction. Tiny, almost invisible, yet devastating. She thanked Thomas and continued walking. But her mind was racing, because she finally understood. Wrong person had been under suspicion from the beginning. The wrong family. The wrong motive. The wrong story. Arthur Hawthorne had inherited guilt. But not criminal intent. Someone else possessed both, and that someone had spent decades waiting. Waiting for revenge. Waiting for proof. Waiting for the perfect opportunity. Evelyn's investigation had accidentally awakened a much older obsession. That afternoon, Miss Marple requested a final meeting. Inspector Finch, Arthur Hawthorne, Richard Hawthorne, Daniel, Clara, Evelyn, and Thomas Reed. Everyone assembled inside the church hall. The atmosphere felt tense, expectant. No one knew why they had been summoned. Only Miss Marple appeared calm. As she looked around the room, she experienced the familiar feeling that always arrived near the end of a mystery, moment when scattered pieces finally formed a complete picture. The truth stood directly before her now. Simple, human, tragic, and dangerous, very dangerous. Because the person who followed Evelyn into the tunnels was sitting in that room, listening carefully, hoping desperately they had escaped suspicion. Miss Marple folded her hands. Then she spoke. "I believe," she said quietly, "that we have all been asking the wrong question." The room fell silent. Outside, church bells began ringing softly across Ashwick Hollow. For one person present, every chime sounded like a warning. Part 7. The tunnel and the truth. The church hall seemed smaller than usual. Perhaps it was the tension. Perhaps it was the knowledge that everyone present had become part of something much larger than a simple disappearance. Outside, afternoon sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting patches of red, gold, and blue across the wooden floor. Inside, nobody spoke. Everyone waited. Miss Marple sat quietly at the head of the room. Her hands rested lightly upon her handbag. Her expression remained calm, almost gentle. Yet, those who knew her understood something important. When Miss Marple looked this calm, somebody was usually about to have a very unpleasant day. Inspector Finch leaned forward. You said we'd been asking the wrong question. Yes. What should we be asking instead? Miss Marple smiled faintly. For days, everyone has asked who followed Evelyn into the tunnels. She glanced around the room. Reasonable question. Nobody disagreed. But it isn't the most important one. Arthur Hawthorne frowned. What is? Miss Marple turned toward him. The important question is why. Silence followed, she continued. Because once we understand the motive, the identity becomes obvious. Thomas Reed shifted slightly in his chair. The movement was small, almost invisible. Miss Marple noticed. Evelyn watched the elderly woman carefully. Since her rescue, she had tried reconstructing every detail of that night. The footsteps, the collapse, the fear. Nothing seemed clear. Nothing except one thing. Someone had been there. Someone who knew about the tunnels. Someone who wanted something. Miss Marple's voice interrupted her thoughts. 30 years ago, Jonathan Hawthorne committed fraud. Arthur lowered his eyes. Richard stared at the floor. Neither objected. The evidence discovered in the tunnels had ended all denial. Fraud ruined several families, Miss Marple continued. Some lost land, some lost livelihoods, some lost futures. Thomas Reed's face hardened, only briefly, but long enough. Miss Marple noticed that too. Village remembered Jonathan Hawthorne as a benefactor. She paused. Others remembered him differently. Inspector Finch nodded. So far, we know all that. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. What interests me is not Jonathan Hawthorne. The room grew still. It is Samuel Reed. Thomas looked up sharply. The name hung in the air. Samuel Reed, his grandfather. A man dead for many years. Inspector Finch frowned. What does Samuel Reed have to do with this? Miss Marple folded her hands. Everything. Thomas Reed remained silent, but something had changed in his expression. A tiny crack. The first visible sign of anxiety. Miss Marple continued gently. Samuel Reed spent years trying to recover proof of Jonathan Hawthorne's crimes. Thomas said nothing. He knew documents existed. Still silence. He searched for them. The old groundskeeper's jaw tightened. You've spoken to people. Yes. Miss Marple nodded. Quite a few people. Thomas looked away, toward the church window, toward the cemetery beyond, toward memories that had never truly faded. My grandfather was cheated. The words emerged quietly. Nobody interrupted. He lost everything. His voice carried decades of bitterness. His farm, a pause. His home, another pause. Dignity. Arthur Hawthorne lowered his head. Thomas laughed softly. A sad laugh, the kind produced by old wounds. You know what happens when a man spends years telling the truth and nobody believes him? No one answered. He becomes a joke. The room felt colder somehow. Thomas's eyes moved toward Arthur. My grandfather died knowing he had been right. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, but he never found proof. Another nod. Thomas smiled. A strange smile. Not happy, not angry. Just tired. Neither did I. The silence lasted several seconds. Then Inspector Finch spoke. What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple? She looked at him. Thomas Reed followed Evelyn into the tunnels. The words landed heavily. Clara gasped. Daniel stared. Arthur looked shocked. Only Thomas remained motionless. Inspector Finch narrowed his eyes. Explain. Miss Marple nodded. Gladly. She turned toward Thomas. You inherited your grandfather's obsession. The old man didn't deny it. You spent decades searching for evidence. Still no denial. You worked in the church grounds. A pause. Knew the village history. Another pause. You knew more about those tunnels than anyone else alive. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Miss Marple continued. When Evelyn began researching Eleanor Price's diary, you noticed. Evelyn's heart skipped, because suddenly everything sounded possible. Everything. You realized she might succeed where your grandfather failed. Thomas opened his eyes. For the first time, genuine emotion appeared there. Pain. Old pain. The kind that never completely heals. I wanted the truth. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Miss Marple nodded. I know. You think that's a crime? No. The answer surprised everyone, even Thomas. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Wanting justice is not a crime, she paused. Following a young woman into unstable tunnels was reckless. Thomas looked away, and that was answer enough. The room remained silent. Inspector Finch finally spoke. You followed her? Thomas nodded slowly. Yes. The confession sounded strangely relieving, as though he had grown tired of carrying the secret. I never intended to harm her. Evelyn believed him immediately. So did Miss Marple. Some lies sounded convincing. Some truths sounded painful. This sounded painful. Thomas rubbed his hands together. I saw her enter the crypt. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. I followed. Why? Finch asked. 'Cause I thought she'd found the documents. A bitter smile appeared. For 30 years, I couldn't stay away. The answer made terrible sense. Thomas continued. Tried calling after her. Evelyn suddenly remembered. A voice in the darkness. Sentence overheard by the groundskeeper. You don't understand what you're digging up. She stared. It was you. Thomas nodded. Yes, I thought you were threatening me. His shoulders sagged. I was warning you. The realization hit everyone at once. The mysterious statement had never been a threat. It had been concern. Concern badly expressed. Miss Marple wasn't surprised. Human beings often communicated poorly during emotional moments. Inspector Finch frowned. If that's true, what caused the collapse? Thomas looked exhausted. I don't know. The answer seemed genuine. Miss Marple spoke softly. I believe I do. Everyone turned toward her. She smiled sadly. Collapse was an accident. No one spoke. Psst. It occurred because several support stones had weakened over decades. She glanced toward Evelyn. When two frightened people hurried through the passage, the vibrations were enough. Inspector Finch considered the explanation. The engineering report supported it. The damage patterns supported it. Everything supported it. For days they had searched for attempted murder. There had been none, only fear, coincidence, and very bad luck. Evelyn sat quietly. A strange mixture of relief and sadness washed over her. Nobody had tried to kill her. Nobody had planned her disappearance. The mystery that terrified the village had emerged from something far more ordinary. Human obsession, human mistakes, human fear. Miss Marple seemed to read her thoughts. They often do, my dear. Evelyn blinked. Most mysteries. A faint smile touched the old woman's lips. They begin with people, not crimes. Inspector Finch stood. So that's it? Miss Marple looked toward him. Not quite. The room grew still again, because everyone recognized that tone. There was one final piece remaining, most important one. Miss Marple glanced toward Arthur Hawthorne, then toward Thomas Reed, two men carrying different burdens. One inherited guilt, the other inherited anger. Both had spent decades imprisoned by choices they never personally made. The documents will restore the truth. She spoke quietly. Property records can be corrected. Thomas stared at her. Arthur looked equally stunned. The law will decide the details, Miss Marple continued, but neither of you can change the past. Nobody moved. Jonathan Hawthorne caused tremendous harm. Arthur closed his eyes. Samuel Reed suffered terribly. Thomas looked away. Miss Marple's voice softened. But allowing old ghosts to control the living only creates new tragedies. The words settled heavily across the room, because everyone knew they were true, and because sometimes truth hurts more than lies. Outside, evening sunlight spread across Ashwick Hollow. For the first time in days, the village felt peaceful. Mystery had been solved, or almost solved. One final conversation remained, one final explanation, and one final lesson hidden beneath 30 years of secrets. The meeting ended, and people slowly departed. Miss Marple remained seated beside the window, watching, thinking, 'cause she knew something the others did not. The real ending of this story had nothing to do with tunnels, or missing documents, or fraud. It concerned forgiveness. Forgiveness, she had learned long ago, was often the hardest mystery of all. Part 8. Miss Marple's final explanation, finale and epilogue. 3 weeks later, summer returned to Ashwick Hollow. The village looked much the same as it always had. The church bells still rang each morning. Children still crossed the square on their way to school. The baker still opened before sunrise. The river still reflected the sky like polished glass. Yet anyone who truly knew Ashwick Hollow understood something had changed forever. Secrets that had survived for 30 years had finally come into the light, and once truth appears, it cannot easily be hidden again. The official investigation concluded sooner than many expected. Documents recovered from the tunnels proved beyond doubt that Jonathan Hawthorne had orchestrated a long-running property fraud. Several land transfers had been falsified. Signatures had been forged. Records had been altered. Families throughout Ashwick Hollow had suffered because of those actions. The discovery shocked neighbouring villages. Newspapers carried the story. Lawyers became involved. Historical claims were reviewed. Some compensation was eventually arranged for surviving descendants of the affected families. It was not a perfect solution. Nothing could truly restore what had been lost. Years stolen from people could not be returned. Lives damaged by injustice could not simply be repaired. Yet it was something. And sometimes, Miss Marple reflected, justice arrived imperfectly, but it arrived nonetheless. Arthur Hawthorne aged noticeably during those weeks. The burden he had carried for years had finally become public. To many villagers, he remained a victim of his father's choices. To others, he remained guilty for remaining silent. Neither judgment felt entirely fair, nor entirely unfair. Human beings, Miss Marple often thought, preferred simple categories. Good people, bad people, heroes, villains. Reality rarely cooperated. One afternoon, Arthur requested a private meeting with Thomas Reed. The entire village seemed to hold its breath. Some expected arguments, others expected accusations. Few feared violence. Instead, the two elderly men met quietly beside the cemetery wall. No one heard most of their conversation. But witnesses later saw them shake hands before parting. Neither smiled. Yet something appeared lighter afterward, as though two old ghosts had finally been laid to rest. Meanwhile, Evelyn Hart became something of an accidental local celebrity. Visitors occasionally stopped her in the village square. Journalists attempted interviews. One London newspaper even described her as the girl who vanished before midnight. Evelyn disliked the attention. The article ignored what mattered most. People spoke endlessly about the disappearance. Very few spoke about the truth she had uncovered. That frustrated her, because she had never wanted fame. She wanted honesty. One afternoon, she sat beside the river with Clara. The summer sun warmed the grass around them. For the first time in months, they felt relaxed, truly relaxed. Clara tossed a small stone into the water. "You nearly gave me a heart attack." Evelyn laughed softly. "So I've heard. From everyone, probably." They sat quietly for a moment. Then Clara's expression softened. "We're brave." Evelyn shook her head. "Yes, I was stubborn. That's basically the same thing." Evelyn smiled. Perhaps it was, at least a little. Daniel Pierce visited her later that evening. The village had begun noticing something amusing. Whenever Evelyn appeared somewhere, Daniel was usually nearby. Whenever Daniel appeared somewhere, Evelyn was usually nearby. People drew their own conclusions, as villagers often do. They walked together through the square, while golden evening light illuminated the old buildings. For a while, neither spoke. Comfortable silence existed between them now, silence earned through shared fear and relief. Eventually Daniel cleared his throat, a sure sign he was nervous. Lynn immediately recognized it. Something on your mind? A few things, only a few. He laughed. Maybe more. They continued walking. Then Daniel stopped. The sudden seriousness in his face caught her attention. I thought I'd lost you. The words emerged quietly, without drama, without performance, simply honest. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. Because she remembered those dark days underground, the loneliness, the uncertainty, desperate hope that someone might find her. Somehow she knew Daniel had experienced his own version of that darkness above ground. She stepped closer. So did I. Neither looked away. Neither needed to. Some truths required no further explanation. The village would eventually receive the rest of the story, piece by piece. But that moment belonged only to them. Several days later, Miss Marple prepared to leave Ashwick Hollow. The mystery was solved. Her work was finished, at least officially. The vicar accompanied her to the bus stop. You always leave before people can properly thank you. Miss Marple smiled. My dear vicar, mysteries are rather like guests. What do you mean? They should know when it's time to depart. The vicar laughed. Then, his expression became thoughtful. There is something I still don't understand. Only one thing? Several things, actually. How reassuring. The vicar smiled despite himself. First made you suspect Thomas Reed. Miss Marple looked toward the village. The answer seemed simple now, yet it hadn't been at the beginning. He cared too much. The vicar blinked. Too much. Most witnesses remember events. She adjusted her gloves. Thomas remembered emotions. The vicar considered this, Miss Marple continued. He spoke about the past as though he still lived there. A pause. People who cannot release old pain often remain connected to it in ways they don't realize. The vicar nodded slowly. Then you never believed he wanted to hurt Evelyn? No. The answer came immediately. Not for a moment. What gave you that confidence? Miss Marple smiled gently. Human nature, the vicar laughed. Course. People rarely become murderers overnight. She looked toward the church steeple rising above the village rooftops. Thomas wanted justice. A pause. Fortunately, obsession and justice sometimes stand dangerously close together. The bus arrived. Marple climbed aboard. Before taking her seat, she glanced once more toward Ashwick Hollow. The village appeared peaceful beneath the afternoon sun. Beautiful, ordinary, exactly the sort of place outsiders imagined free from darkness. Yet Miss Marple knew better. Every village contained secrets. Every family carried hidden stories. Every human heart possessed corners even its owner struggled to understand. That was not a flaw of humanity, merely a fact. The important thing was what people chose to do with those secrets. Whether they buried them, protected them, or confronted them. Ashwick Hollow had finally chosen the third option. Because of that, it had a chance to heal. Months later, life slowly returned to normal. Carnival banners came down. Autumn approached. Children forgot newspaper headlines. Visitors stopped asking questions. The mystery faded into history, but certain changes remained. The church archives received new funding. Historical records were carefully preserved. Several families recovered documents, proving their rightful heritage. Arthur Hawthorne began supporting restoration projects anonymously. Thomas Reed spent less time in the cemetery and more time in his garden, and Evelyn Hart continued her research, though now she approached mysteries with slightly more caution. Slightly. Not much. Some personalities never change. One evening she discovered a note tucked inside Eleanor Price's diary. A note she had somehow overlooked before, perhaps because it had slipped between two pages. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. The message was short, only one sentence. Truth may walk slowly, but eventually it arrives. Evelyn sat quietly for several moments. Then she smiled. Because Eleanor had been right. The truth had arrived, 30 years late, but it had arrived. And so the story of the girl who vanished before midnight became part of Ashwick Hollow's history, not as a tale of murder, nor as a tale of supernatural disappearance, but as something far more human, a story about secrets, about memory, about inherited pain, about the weight of the past, and above all, about the remarkable persistence of truth. For truth, like the river flowing through Ashwick Hollow, could disappear from sight for a while. It could travel underground, hide beneath stone, remain unseen for years, yet sooner or later it always found its way back into the light, the end.